Hi there, this is John. Several people have asked me to do a voiceover for a session that I did in Singapore during the week. This was for Food Industry Asia and A Star. So, what I'd like to do is do a very abbreviated version. The session itself was about 30 minutes, and I tried to do this somewhere in between 10 to 15 minutes, and I'd go over the rooftops of some of the key slides with a few of the key messages. Again, the more detailed discussion occurred at the event itself, but I don't want you sitting here for 30, 40 minutes going through this. But if you have any questions on any of the key areas that I discuss, please let me know. And before I go into that, I just wanted to mention the disclaimer here that the information that I pulled together was for information purposes and educational purposes as such, not commercially intended. And all reasonable efforts on my behalf were taken to make sure I had the proper attribution in the slides and the material. But if you find anything, please let me know. Also, if you have feedback, just send me some info via my email below here. So this was the session. We had I did the keynote, and then we had a fantastic panel. We had Origin Trail from Europe. We had Nielsen talking about consumer insights. We had PricewaterhouseCoopers. We had an IT scientist from A-Star, in fact, two of them, talking about big data, smart data, and also sentiment, which is trying to extract sarcasm from comments online. So brilliant discussion and very, very, very fruitful. My agenda went through supply chain complexity, transparency and trust, IoT, smart data and blockchain in the food chain, and the same in the smart home. And then I talked about blockchain briefly, and then I summarized. Now, I'll give you a forewarning. My very last slide in the summary is an academic slide, and it forms part of my own doctoral research, and so be forewarned for that. Now, this slide, I could spend an hour or 2 hours on it. Essentially, what I mentioned to the audience is that this starts and finishes with a consumer on the right-hand side with their family sitting down to a meal, and the whole supply chain is intended. We hope that it has worked in their behalf, on their behalf, and with positive intentions. But we can see the complexity here in the supply chains. Just the yellow line alone represents the potato supply chain going back to the farm. And there's a lot more inputs coming into the farm. A key point I mentioned as well is that global supply chains are borderless, languageless. We need standards, and we need to understand how we translate raw data into structured data and then into information. On transparency and trust, I talked about transparency and the concepts of believability and forthrightness, and also the efforts that companies are taking all around the world to make sure that they try to bridge that information asymmetry gap with consumers and make labels a little bit simpler, and also to explain what's going on in the supply chains. And of course, transparency is about shining a light into a supply chain, because consumers are more aware. Even if it's a simple apple, did it sit in the barrel for 9 months in a dark room before it got to the retail? How was it processed? Was there slavery involved in picking the apples? And was it from a sustainable source? So consumers are asking a lot more questions these days. And of course, they also want to know if the product was modified. Did you mess with my food? Now, I won't go through the definition here, but I'll leave it for you. This is the most common definition from Geert-Jan Hofstede, Dutch professor, and it talks about transparency of a net chain. Net chain here is intended to be a conflation of both networks and supply chain. What's most important here is that it's information, product-related information that stakeholders request. If stakeholders don't request it, why provide it? And without loss, noise, delay, or distortion. Of course, the noise and the distortion is coming from marketing, but also from the cheaters in the system. The distortion is where they're leaving out some ingredients, but also selling a product as organic when it's not organic. And I like this line also from Hofstede. If information is the lifeblood of an organization, then think of transparency as enabling it to flow. So from a trust perspective, trust is a very interesting concept. It's very well researched. But unfortunately, it's very, very difficult for us to manage trust in extended global supply chains. One of the 140 different definitions that's in literature, this is one of the most common in consumer studies, a psychological state comprising of the intention to accept a vulnerability upon positive expectations of the intentions of others. So essentially what that means to me is that when this family sat down recently for their Thanksgiving dinner, that they were indeed vulnerable, and they expected that your complete supply chain acted in their best interest. And I think this is the biggest problem that we have, because trust has two enemies. And what I talked about here in this slide is, on the one hand, you have bad character, and then you also have bad data. On the one hand, it's impossible to eliminate. This is where enforcement gather information, gather evidence, and look to enforce the law. And on the bad data side, this is something that companies can work on. So on the one hand, thinking like a criminal, using vulnerability assessments and S-Safe. This is an association of several food companies, and PricewaterhouseCoopers and several others are bringing vulnerability assessments to markets that will help to understand the criminal element in the supply chain. What I mentioned here is that GS1 has all of the tools that you need to improve the data within your organizations. So this area on smart farms or future farms, this is an area where IoT, blockchain, and smart data is helping to keep farm animals healthy, improve the welfare yields, and also to reduce animal mortality rates. So we talk about survey drones, fleets of agrobots, smart tractors, and farmers not farming the land anymore, but farming the data as well. And of course with texting cows. Now, the use of drones, fixed wing, and balloons are becoming more and more popular as farmers move more into precision agriculture. And this is a fascinating area of growth. And then of course we have the connected cow. And if I can just build a slide here. This is where many different devices are placed on the animal or in the animal. And one of those I wanted to point out is a tail sensor. And the tail sensor can help to identify an animal that's in distress. And I believe in the UK alone, they can save up to 100,000 calves and 50,000 cows during the birthing process. But not only for big farmers, there's also small farmers with 20 cows. And in one case, using technology and smart data, the farmer realized that 3 of his cattle were eating twice as much as the rest, but only producing about 50% of the milk. Now, it turned out after DNA analysis that 3 cows were sisters, and now those 3 sisters are hamburgers. So up to 9 different behaviors being monitored. About 15 years ago, I was involved in these types of projects on large feedlots in Alberta, where we were looking at how to apply the technology into certain areas. In one case, we were trying to take a sick animal out of the supply chain, and a sick animal doesn't drink water. So we ended up talking to the farmer, placing antennas at the water troughs, and really understanding the business problem driven by regulation, which said if you have a sick animal, it has to be taken out of the supply chain. And then coming back from that and saying, how do you identify that animal? What is the behavior of that animal? And really understanding it at a granular level before you apply the technology. And I think that's very important. So we place antennas at the water trough, and we set a rule that if the animal didn't come there within 4.5 hours, it would send an alert to the farmer to extract the animal from the supply chain. And the other part here is that we have a common perception, and let me just overlay the slide here. We have a perception I'm calling this the smart cow, that we think that animals are full of pharmaceuticals and they're unhealthy and so on and so forth. But I think with all of this technology that's being brought to bear on farms and on animals, I think it's reasonable to assume that our animals will have less of a dependency on pharmaceuticals over time. And then with the use of the technology, we'll be able to share that information with consumers and have it trusted and more transparent and more trusted. So I think there's great opportunities for us to use the technology at the farm to bridge that information asymmetry gap with consumers. Now, I'm a vegan, and I'm actually the complete supporter of all of this stuff. I think it's just fantastic. So moving on from here, there are some projects in Europe funded by the EU called Internet of Farming 2020. So if you go to the website down here on the bottom right-hand side, you'll find some more information about what they're doing on arable, dairy, fruits, vegetables, and meats. This is an area I'm quite interested in. It's a small device that came from Bühler, and it's an IoT rice analyzer. So in the past, the farmer would have to have a capital expense, so they have to pay sometimes large sums of money to actually buy some advanced technology. Bühler has this device where the farmer can pay like 150 or 160 bucks a month and get some real value. This is an example of where the technology is coming out of the laboratories and really reducing time for the farmer to do the analysis and take corrective action on the farm. So this is an area of significant growth. So now we look at the smart home, and I was provocative here by talking about the Internet of Toilets. And again, the provocative nature of my discussion was we need to start rethinking about what we have at home. We have our standard toilet, but there's no reason why that cannot evolve into a smart health center, and you do all sorts of health checks when you're actually in the room. So for example, if I take this example here on the top right, can you imagine going to the washroom at 4 a.m. in the morning? Your toilet is connected with the weather online, and it has a light here. It's a green light, means, John, it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Similarly, if it was a different color, it may indicate that it's raining. Get up a half an hour earlier and take the subway rather than your bicycle. Now, the next one again is being provocative and trying to stretch the imagination here, that I don't think there's any reason why our toilets cannot do rudimentary testing on our produce. And it's up to the scientists, of course, and the ethicists to look at what could be done and how it could be done and why it should be done. But I don't know, maybe detecting pathogens or giving you other sorts of feedback that's important to keep you healthy. And of course, these personal screenings sent to a health service provider can automatically adjust your diet and your products and send products to you that maybe have different nutrient components, or they may suggest medical intervention. And this is all connected to what I called in the section Smart Living, where you have smart home connected to smart retail, you have smart agriculture connecting to smart health, again, giving feedback from the smart health to smart agriculture around fortification of goods. And of course, when that information goes back to retail or goes back to the food companies, that can also form some ideas around R&D for new products. So essentially what we have here is a massive convergence to get to this area of smart living and smart cities and so on and so forth. And I think at the very, very high level, what's happening here is we need to have a convergence of social science and natural science to be able to figure this out. Now on blockchain, again, I'll go through this very quickly, but my statement here is that blockchain will be the silver bullet for transaction trust over time. And there's a fantastic article that came out from Harvard Business Review earlier this year that talked about blockchain being foundational rather than disruptive. And there's a lot of meaning behind this, and I think it's important for people to look at this. A lot of people will say, no, blockchain is disruptive. Of course, it'll have disruptive nature in several industries, but the context of this is that it will probably follow the same path as TCP/IP did in the development of the internet. Hence, it's a new fabric, it's a new layer, it's not a new technology replacing something immediately. It'll take time to implement. And what the Harvard Review also said, look, this is also going to have unprecedented societal changes and start now. So just in summary, I would say on blockchain that today we have a head and tail strategy, and tomorrow it will provide us with a foundational trust architecture. And the reason I have this little bit of humor in here with the horse is that the use cases will help us to make this into a beautiful racehorse. There's still a lot of work to do. There's work to do on security, on protocols, leaking privacy, on scalability, and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of incredible geniuses all over the world working on this problem, and I'm convinced myself that it is part of the future, it is a critical part of the future, and we will get there. So in summary, what I talked about was transparency and trust are critical for us in an IoT, smart data, and blockchain future, but these constructs have a complex bidirectional relationship and must be matured together. So let me show you this slide, and this is part of my own research, and it looks complex. I'll only spend about 2 minutes on this, and I'll give you an example. At the bottom down here with history transparency and calculus-based trust, history transparency from Hofstede is about traceability. It's the classic what happened in the supply chain. And calculus-based trust is the big contracts, or the contracts that we put in place with our supply base, locally, nationally, and globally to try to mitigate risk and control for behaviors. But both of these are actually based on mistrust, as is regulation. And we know from our food chain transparency that it's classically one step up, one step down, and that's not going to cut it in the future. So what I believe will happen is that transparency will be mediated by blockchain technology. And let me give you an example of that. In the case of Walmart, and Frank Yanis, the VP of Food Safety at Walmart, has worked with IBM, and I'm sure most people have seen this right now. They've moved up to what I would consider, in my research, strategic transparency and identification-based trust. So in other words, when they were operating down here in the RMT area, which is regulation-mediated transparency, they were looking at one up, one down. They were complying with regulation. And they did an example. They looked at a mango supply chain, and it took them, I believe it was 6 days, 18 hours, and 22 minutes to do a traceback for a food safety issue. And up in the top box here, where I have TMT, or transparency mediated, or technology mediated transparency, um, they got all of the parties working together. So strategic transparency, bidirectional flow of information, joint planning for the future, and identification-based trust is on common intention. So the common intention here was to increase food safety. Now, Frank always talks about, look, we were not chasing blockchain here, we were chasing improvements in food safety. So I think this is a brilliant example. Below the line here, when we're in the area of mistrust, it took them 6 days, 18 hours, and 22 minutes. And up in this new era, where they were using IoT, smart data, and blockchain, it took them 2.2 seconds. Absolutely incredible. So congratulations to Walmart and IBM and all of the people who participated in that. Great achievement, great example of leadership. So the recipe for success for me is very, very simple. We need to have social science and natural science coming together in an IoT-based future. And for those of you who are doubting this, social scientists are indeed real scientists. So thank you very much. This is the first time I've done a recording. It's just under 17 minutes, and appreciate your feedback and look forward to engaging with you. Thank you.